Myth number 5, okay? Medications fix the problem. Once you understand the underlying problem or the underlying causes of insulin resistance, which therefore leads to diabetes, right? And you can even include like fatty liver disease into this process, right? Once you understand that the causes, it makes sense where the medications don't fix the problem. They may help you to stay alive, right, in the short term and keep you functioning, but over time, they're actually going to dig you further in debt. I think a really great analogy would be to say if a person had a spending problem, right? They're spending too much money. They can't hold a budget. They can't, they're spending way more money than what they make. And somebody came along to them and said, hey, your bank account is really low. In fact, it's starting to get like very low, right? I'm going to give you this card, right? And this card, it's called a credit card. And now you can actually keep spending more money, right? And keep spending more and more, right? And so what happens with these medications is the person starts to spend more and more money, right? They get to go back to their lifestyle, right? When we compare that to your lifestyle, right? Where there's underlying problems that aren't being addressed. And so instead of addressing the spending problem, right, the lifestyle problem, they're being given a pill or a credit card to dig themselves further in debt. And so that's where you'll see people that say, well, once I went on the medication, right, I started to gain weight. Or they'll come in and they'll be on 1, then 2, then 3, then 4 medications. They'll be on a statin. They'll be on, the next thing you know, they're having heart problems, right? So they're on heart medications, blood thinners, aspirin, all these different things that start to add up with time, right? And so when we talk about that, right, these medications work pretty much like a credit card when you look at this, right? When you start to break this down. So when we look at even diet and exercise, right, we know that through changing very specific lifestyle changes that we can improve insulin resistance, that we can help to mitigate the damage and start to reverse some of that fatty liver disease. And what happens with diabetics is actually they start to develop a fatty pancreas, where that pancreas actually starts to get fat tissue, and then the pancreas stops being able to work as efficiently. So what do some of these medications do once that person is diabetic, or even now they're starting to give these credit cards out before the person ever becomes diabetic, right? Saying, hey, let's get you start on this right away. Let's increase your spending limit right off the bat, right? So if you look at this, right, metformin, probably the safest of all of them, but even this one right now as we're making this video is being reviewed by the FDA for potentially containing cancer-causing properties. Now, I don't think that's the biggest problem with it. Yes, they help you to mitigate some of this damage and help your body to control blood sugar levels a little bit easier, and also have effects on the liver. I'm going to circle back to that in a second. Actually, let's talk about this right now. This was actually from looking at some of the research on, they took and they went and these researchers from PLS Medicine basically looked at this broad range of different studies on metformin, and what they found was basically they found no evidence that metformin, considered to be the first-line treatment for diabetes, has any beneficial effect on all-cause mortality, on cardiovascular mortality, or on cardiovascular morbidity among patients with type 2 diabetes. Kind of interesting, right, when you actually start to look at this. Anything from when it comes to risk of death, right, either a 25% decrease or a 31% increase, depending upon what study you're looking at, right? Note, however, the editors and others indicated that the study is not definitive and further studies are urgently indicated, right? But I think we can all agree that these studies aren't going to happen, right? So what you're seeing, right, or when it comes to cardiovascular mortality, right, a 33% decrease or a 64% increase. So all you're going to hear about is the good stuff if it's good, right? They're not going to tell you about the studies that showed pretty scary effects, right? So the jury isn't even out whether this helps you survive long term or not, right? And so that's when we talk about actually addressing these lifestyle problems and correcting the underlying issue. We know elevated insulin levels has impact on mortality, on heart disease, on virtually every chronic disease known to man, but it's not being looked at, it's not being measured, right? How does this next one work, hey? Okay, so the glipizide, right? Fancy names for these sulfonylureas, and what they do is they help to trigger the release of insulin, right? Some other smaller effects, but they actually push your pancreas to trigger more release of insulin, okay? Now let's think about this, right? If basically how that worked, that's basically like expanding your credit line, right? Your credit card line, right? So if a person's already insulin resistant, right, and because of their lifestyle factors and because of some underlying issues, inflammation, these sort of things, and their blood glucose levels continue to rise as they become more insulin resistant, what this does is it forces the pancreas to put more insulin out to try to drive those numbers down. What those sulfonylureas do is they trigger the release of more insulin from your pancreas. In other words, they push your pancreas to produce more insulin. It's kind of like having the same credit card, but increasing that credit line, right? We're going to give you more of a credit line, right? And so what happens is when we have these different lifestyle factors or underlying inflammation, or these different issues that are going on that are causing, elevated those blood glucose levels to continue to rise, let's say, well, let's use some of this medication to force your pancreas to work harder, right, and push out more insulin. Well, what happens is at some point, right, so it's going to work harder, but also those elevated insulin levels can be cancer promoting. The elevated insulin has a lot of different long-term physiological effects, right? And maybe this is why those levels aren't actually tested in people, because then we'd have to actually admit that maybe what we're doing is actually causing long-term damage by not addressing the actually underlying problems. Again, another medication triggering the release of more insulin from the pancreas as well. There's also a concept that's becoming newer, more looked at, is the potential for pancreatic fatigue, meaning once that and basically it's called latent LADA, latent autoimmune diabetes, and so when we look at that number, right, latent meaning over time, right, slow underlying. Where that pancreas actually becomes fatigued and it can't keep up anymore. And a person has to wonder, do these medications play a part? Because that question has never necessarily been asked, that I believe, that I've seen. The last one, right, the increased fat cell production. Now this is crazy, right? So what they're saying is these medications increase fat production and distribution in muscle tissue instead of liver, pancreas, and visceral fat. Okay, so what they're saying is because we do know that having elevated glucose levels long terms and then therefore high insulin levels starts to put fat deposits into your pancreas and your liver, or that visceral fat around the organs, which is very dangerous. Instead, we'll use these medications to actually push that fat elsewhere, right? So you end up getting fat elsewhere. Kind of like we talk about like muscle tissues, right? Like marbling in meats, right? When that meat, your muscles can actually develop fat, okay, in them. When you think about the ridiculousness of that whole concept, right? Instead of addressing the underlying issue, let's just shove the problem elsewhere, right? So that person continues to get sicker, right? And then your the inhibitors basically, which prevent digestion of carbohydrates. But what they're not going to tell you on this one, right, that prevent digestion of carbohydrates is it can actually create some very serious bowel issues, right? Now, if your carbohydrates aren't getting absorbed and digested, what's going to happen downstream to those carbohydrates? What's going to happen to the microbiome, the bacteria that are growing in your digestive tract? There is actually a connection with your intestinal health and whole body health, including diabetes, right? So if we look at this and what is it doing, none of those questions have ever really been asked, right? What about intestinal infections? What about altered gut microbiome, where you have bad bacteria growing, you have yeast overgrowth, right? All these different issues which are going to create a massive amount of other health issues as that person goes through life. Number 3, or the last one that I'm going to talk about, is insulin, right? So literally just giving insulin. So specifically, and that's where we talk about that, the whole putting things on a credit card, right? Where if your blood sugars keep going up because of your lifestyle, because of everything you're putting into it over and over again, doc says, hey, let's put some insulin in your body to bring down those blood glucose levels. But they don't tell you insulin itself. Insulin is a fat storage hormone, so metabolically it increases fat storage and shuts down fat burning. Okay, same thing's going to happen here, right? If it's triggering the release of more insulin. It's a very much anabolic hormone in the human body, meaning it causes cellular growth. So there's a connection with high elevated insulin levels long-term in cancer. Okay, we talk about neurologic degeneration, we talk about heart problems, right? All these things, right? When we look at chronically elevated insulin levels, there's some very serious issues with it long-term. Is it going to help to keep you alive short-term? Yes, absolutely, right? There's no denying that, right? However, without addressing the cause, it's contributing to chronic health problems, okay? So when somebody says medications fix the problem for me, or I have it all under control, I want you to be very wary of that, right? If this is making sense to you, make sure you check out the rest of our videos, obviously, but it's time to get set up, make an appointment, get actually tested to see what those insulin levels are doing, to see how hard, maybe you're not on insulin, maybe you're on one of these, to see how hard your body's being pushed to actually create more insulin, right? So what are those insulin levels in relation to your blood glucose levels? Because there's a number called the HOMO-IR, which is a relationship of basically your relationship of insulin to glucose, which gives us an indication of how insulin resistant you are. And so I want to wrap that up. I hope that gets the point across that just throwing medications at this problem is a very dangerous endeavor, okay? That's all I got for this video. Make sure you check out the rest. If you're ready to make an appointment, by all means, just do it. We'd love to help you. Thank you.